Hello and welcome to this small tutorial on how to create a secure JSF and JPA application using the Payara Platform 5. So let's begin with introductions. My name is Fabio Turizo. I'm a senior service engineer working for Payara Services Limited. And you'll learn today how to create a simple web application using the Java Server Phrases framework. You will learn how to deploy that application using Payara Server 5.201, which is the current latest release at the time of recording. You will learn how to configure this application's persistence settings. That means how to store information and data into a relational database by using the Java Persistence API. And lastly, you will learn how to configure the security of the application's user interface. For this tutorial, you will require the following. First, have a local JDK installation, preferred to be the current long-term support release of Java, which is JDK 11. Have a Java IDE, which will allow you to quickly code and configure your application. So by preference, I'm going to use Apache NetBeans 11.3, which is the current development release. And you will require a relational database. In our case, we're going to use Oracle MySQL version 8, whichever update you want to prefer. However, in my case, I will use a Docker container since that is much easier to use in a local development environment. So, before we begin, let's talk about the application that we'll create. It will be composed of two entities of data that we're going to manipulate. One, it's users. An user just simply, it's a combination of a name and a set of credentials. There's a username and a password. And the user qualities. So in this case, we are just simply going to use qualities as a way to mention general attributes of each user, just simple sets of data that we're going to explore. And for these two entities, we're going to have two views. One, which is the home view, that is the view used to visualize the user's profile information, in this case, his name and its qualities. And another information view that will allow us to see all the users that are currently created in our system. The next step will be to prepare our database. So in order, we'll have to create a new database schema. A new database user which will have privileges over this recently created schema. And then we'll have to prepare our application tables, one table for the users and one table for the qualities. Start by provisioning our Docker container. So in this case, I'll run a new Docker container named MySQL 8 based on the official MySQL image from Oracle and using the 8.0 tag. I will set the root password for this new container to MySQL 8 because it's a development. Set this as a background container and map the container port 3306 to the same local port so that I can connect to it locally. And let's wait a few seconds and let's use MySQL Workbench to connect to the database. So in this case, you can see here that I have a local connection to by using the root user, and I can connect to the database. So let's start provisioning our elements. First, let's create the sample underscore app schema. Next, let's create a user account that will have access to that schema. So in this case, it will be sample underscore user and the password sample underscore app, sample underscore app. So ignore the weak password warning because we are working on a development environment. So at the moment, that's not a concern. Let's then add privileges for the sample underscore app schema. Let's select all privileges, hit apply, and that's it. Our elements are ready. So let's head back to the sample app schema and let's create the tables for our entities. The first table will be the users table, which in this case will add the following columns: the ID, which will be an integer, it will be the primary key, not null, and it will be automatically incrementally generated by the database. Next, the name, which in this case will be a bar chart of 45 characters, which is fine. It will be not null. Then the username, which will be a bar chart of, we can say, 15 characters. It will be not null and it will be uniquely identified within the table. Then the user underscore password, which will be, since we are hashing passwords later in this tutorial, we require the maximum value, which is 255, and in this case it will be not null. And lastly, the user group, which is the group or role that this user belongs to. So in this case, we are setting this to 25, and it will be not null as well, and we can delete this, hit apply. And proceed to create the qualities table. So in this case, the name will be qualities. You will have a column name ID, which will be the primary key, not null, and auto-incrementally generated. Then the description of the quality, which in this case, I think that 255 will be good. It will be not null. And lastly, the user underscore ID, which corresponds to the ID of the user that this quality belongs. So in this case, it will be not null. And we have to set a foreign key. In this case, we'll call it quality user ID FK. It will map to the users table. We map the user ID to the ID of the user in the respective table. And let's hit apply and finish, and our tables have been created and our database is ready to go. Now with the database ready, we'll have to prepare our Payara server installation in order to connect to it. First, we'll download our official MySQL 8 connector JDBC driver, which will allow our server to talk to the database directly. Well, then we'll have to start the server, install the driver into the default domain, restart the domain, and then configure our JDBC resources. These resources will be a connection pool, which will abstract all connections retrieved from the database, and a JDBC data source, which will allow applications to talk to the server in order to receive these connections and manipulate data. So first, let's download the driver, and in order to do that, you will have to head to the official MySQL community downloads page. Now, here you will select in your operating systems platform independent, and depending on of your preference, you will choose either the compressor.gc file or the zip file. So press download, ignore the Oracle login, and save the file, and that's it. With the file download, now let's head to NetBeans. So on the services, under the servers component, you can see that I have a Payara Server 501 installation already registered. So the only thing that I have to do is to start it. So my server will take 1 or 2 minutes to be fully ready. And now it is ready. So in order to install the driver, there are multiple ways to do this, but I think that the simplest way is just to use the command line interface. So let's head here. Let's head to the folder where my server is installed. So now let's head to the bin folder and let's run the asadmin command. The asadmin interface will allow me to specify a command, so I will use the add library command, and then I'll specify the jar file of the MySQL driver that I recently downloaded. So 8 Okay, and then it will be MySQL connector Java 8 or 19 Java. And that's it. That's successfully been added. So I have to restart the server installation because the driver is still not fully ready in the application server due to the way that class loading works. So let's head over here. Let's clear this and let's hit the restart button, which will stop the Payara server domain, and then we'll restart it. And now that this is ready, let's start the web console, which will allow me to set up the database resources. So localhost 4848. Now let's head on the resources JDBC and let's add first the connection pool. So in this case, let's add a new pool called Secure App Pool. Resource type can either be data source or connection pool data source, depending on your requirements. For this simple sample, we'll use Java SQL data source. Database driver vendor will be MySQL 8 explicitly. Let's hit next. Now we have to configure the properties for our database connection. So in order to make this simple, let's just simply select all the properties, delete them, and let's add manually the required properties for my simple configuration. So I require 6 properties. The first one will be the database name, which in this case is sample_app. Next one will be the user, which is sample_user. Next one will be the password, which in this case is sample pass. Remember that this is development. On a production environment, you would use a password alias. Next is the server name, which in this case would be localhost because I'm running a Docker container locally. Next will be the port number, which is 3306. And finally, in order to connect to the database in a non-secure manner, because MySQL forces a secure connection by default, I will set the use SSL option as false. So once all these properties are ready, let's hit finish. Let's check out that I can connect to my database by pinging it, and you can see that the ping is successful. So with the connection pool ready, let's create my JDBC data source. So in this case, I have to specify a JNDI name, which is a global name that will allow my JDBC resource to be accessible by all applications developed and deployed on the Payara server. So by convention, the JDBC resources on Payara server are prefixed by JDBC/, and then I can specify secure app DS, and this is the name that I would use to identify it. And we'll tie this data source to the secure app pool that we created. Let's hit OK. And that's it. Our data source is ready. Let's focus on our application code then. First, we'll start by creating a new Maven project, which will be of type WAR file. Then we'll proceed to create the 2 new entity classes, which will be the user and quality entities. We'll prepare services in order to persist the data of both, and then finally we'll create user interface web pages for the views that we discussed earlier using Jakarta server faces. Let's go to NetBeans then. So let's hit File, new project, Java with Maven web application. Let's select the folder where I want my project to reside. So I'll say here in demos. Let's say that the group ID will be fish Payara demos version 1.0 snapshot, which is the common default, and the name of the project will be Secure Web Application. Let's hit next. Let's select the server, which is Payara Server 5201. Java E, well, in this case, Java or Jakarta EE version will be version 8. And then let's hit finish. And my project should be created shortly. Cool. So let's do some minor adjustments. So let's open the POM file of this application. First, let's set the name without the version in order to be more readable. Let's update the version of the Maven compiler plugin to the latest one. We are not going to use endorse extension, so let's remove these arguments. Let's update the version of the WAR plugin to the latest one. And we do not need the Maven dependency plugin in order to set up endorse extensions. Okay, that's it. Excellent. Lastly, we want to run this application using JDK 11. So let's specify here JDK 11 default, and on the sources, let's specify 11. So you can see here that the sources are set, and we only need to remove this, which is not needed. This is not needed, and that's it. So our project has been initialized successfully. Now we'll have to go to source package, and you can see here that there are two app classes that were added by NetBeans. These are useful for JAX-RS service applications, but in this case we won't be using them. So let's delete this package. Okay, let's delete this class, and let's rename our package as Payara demos only. So let's start by adding our entity classes. So let's add a new Java package called entities. Let's add a new class called user. Let's delete them comments, and then let's start. So since this is an entity, let's annotate it with entity from the JavaX Persistence API. The class should be serializable, and we have to specify a table configuration. So in this case, let's use the table annotation. Let's specify that the name of the table that is mapped to this entity is users. And that's it. These are the attributes. So let's start with the ID, which in this case is an integer. And we have to annotate it using the JavaX Persistence IDE annotation. And also, since we are referring to an auto-incremental value on the database, we have to use the generated value annotation and specify that it's following a generation type of auto, which is an auto increment on the database end. Lastly, we have to specify the column name by using the column annotation and set it to ID in lowercase. Why are we doing this? Because sometimes the JDBC driver doesn't guarantee that the name used by the Java Persistence API provider on the application will match the name on the column. So sometimes, even if it's set to ID like this, it will be converted to uppercase. So by explicitly setting the column name, we are preventing any future errors. So let's continue with the name of the user, which in this case we have to use the same settings, And let's also identify that this is not nullable. Let's continue with the username column name, which will be username. It is also not nullable, and it's also unique. These are just hints for the provider. And lastly, password for the credentials. So we have to specify column. On our database, we name this column user password, since password could be a keyword in the SQL dialect. So this is also nullable. Unique. Sorry, passwords are not unique. Next, and the final attribute will be the user group. So in this case, will be group, and we'll use the column definition, and we name our column user group on the database, since group it's also a reserved keyword for the SQL dialect. So nullable false, and that's it. That's our attributes. So let's define two constructors. All entities should guarantee a default no arguments constructor, so that it's usable reflexively by the persistence provider. We also provide our own constructor that will receive the name, credentials, and the group. Let's create getters for all of these elements. And finally, it is a good practice to also set the equals and hash codes methods for the entity. So in this case, they are based on the private key or the identity of my entity, which in this case is the ID attribute. And that's it. Let's go now and proceed to create the quality entity. So in a similar manner, we'll set up this as an entity. The table will be named qualities. It will implement the serializable interface as well. You'll require an ID that it's automatically generated. We also have to set up the column. We require a description column for our column database, which is in this case will be the description attribute. Okay. This is also not nullable. And we have to specify to which user does this quality belong. So we have to reference an user. In this case, let's call it user. This is a JPA relation. So a user can have multiple qualities. So in this case, this relation is many to one. And we require a join column in order to tie the identifiers of both entities on the respective tables. So in this case, the name of the column in the qualities table is user ID, and the reference column on the users table it's called ID. And this is also not nullable. Cool. Okay, so let's repeat the same process. Let's define a no argument constructor. Let's define a constructor that accepts my description and the user for the quality. Let's define getters for these elements. And lastly, equals and hash code methods in the same bin that we define for the user entity. So with this, our two entities, users and their qualities, are already prepared and they are mapped to the respective tables. Then the next step will be to create our data service for manipulating these entities. Before doing that, we need to add a persistence unit for our application. So let's click here in New, Other, Persistence Unit, and then we'll create a new persistence unit for our application. The Jakarta EE Persistence API allows me to tie the configuration of a data source in my server runtime, which a local construct called the persistence unit, which will allow me to have a persistence context that will allow me to map my entities to the rows in my database and manipulate them accordingly. So unfortunately, NetBeans allows me to create persistence units using this wizard by tying this to a local database connection. So unfortunately, we do not have that because it is located in our server. But we can fool NetBeans by using the default embedded database that has it here, and then we'll manually update our configuration. So let's select here on table creation strategy none. Let's select finish. And then here let's select on the source tab and we can see that the file has been fully created. So let's do the adjustments then. Let's change the transaction type to JTA. Let's delete these properties that are not needed because we already have our database configured on the server. And we'll use the JTA data source and we'll map it to JDBC Secure APIs, which corresponds to the data source that we created on the server. So, okay. And lastly, we also need to define the shared cache mode of my application. In this case, we'll use no cache, so we'll set this as none in order for the files DTD to be compliant. Okay, having done this, let's create our data service, which in this case will be named data service. It will be located in the fish demo services package. And we'll create this as an application scope CDI pin. Okay. Now let's inject my entity manager, which will be providing the persistence context that I mentioned. I'll name it EM. And in order to inject this resource, we'll use the persistence context annotation, which will point to the persistence unit called, in this case, we'll change the persistence unit to Secure App, which is something more readable. So in this case, Secure App, cool. Very well then. So now my service, which will allow me to manipulate both users and their qualities, needs business methods in order to read and write the data from my database. So let's start with a method that will allow me to create new users, and we'll name it fittingly create user. So what do I need? I need the name of the user, username, password, and the group. In order to do this, then I will create a new user, call it new user, and call the constructor that we defined previously. Then let's persist this new user by using the entity manager persist method, and we'll call the entity manager flush method to allow the transaction, the underlying transaction, to commit the changes to the database. And finally, we'll return the new user. Since we need a transactional context in order to execute this method, I have to annotate the business method with transactional, which will allow my CDI bin to inject and provide a transactional context via an interceptor in this. So let's do the same for qualities. So in this case, quality, create quality. You will require description and a user for which the quality belongs to, and then we'll do the same. So quality, new quality, we'll receive the description and the user for the constructor that we used previously. Let's persist it, flush, and return the new quality. Excellent. And we also need to annotate this with transactional. Very well then. So I have two write methods that will allow me to persist data for both users and qualities. I also need methods to read the data from the persistent store. So let's begin with a method that will allow me to retrieve all users that have been registered in the database. So let's call this get all users. And how do we retrieve information from the database? Normally, since we are talking about JPA, we'll have to use a JPA query, which is what we'll define. So let's go to the user entity, define a name query that which will allow me to have a pre-configured query, name user.all, which will allow me to retrieve all user, and let's call select use from user use, which is the alias. And since we are retrieving all users, let's order this by using the ID. Back to our business method, then let's return an entity manager, create name query method, which will receive the name query that we created. We have to specify that the result of this query's execution will be an object of type user. And finally, let's call the get result list method. And with this, we have all users being retrieved by the execution of this query. Next, I need a method that will allow me to retrieve the user's personal information that I will have to use for the home view. So in this case, I'll have a method that returns an user called getUser, and we need an identifier. So I think that we can use a username for the moment in order to retrieve this information. Since it's possible that the results of this query are a non-existent value, since it's possible that you try to retrieve a user that doesn't exist in the database, we'll make the return type of this method optional. So let's return a name query as well, the results of a name query that I'll have to configure now. So let's go back to the user entity, and now I need a new name query to retrieve users based on the usernames. So I need the name queries plural annotation, since I'll have two name queries. And now I'll define my new name query, which in this case is user by username query, which will be select US from user US y US start username equals the parameter with the same name, username. Okay, excellent. So here I'll use my user by username query. Again, the return type will be user.class. I have to set the parameter to username. In this case, will be the username that I'm receiving as an argument to my method. And I'll call the get result list in order to retrieve my list of values. So in this case, if I have a match, it will be a result set with only one element, and I can convert this to a Java 8 string and then call the find first method that will return me an optional user. So if there is a result there, which is the only value in the matches, then it will return it. If not, then return me null, and then it will wrap that in an optional. Okay. Lastly, to complete that profile view, I need a list of all the qualities of a user. So I will create a method called getQualities, and I will receive an argument for the user that these qualities belong to. So again, I need a new name query. This time I locate this on the quality entity. So name query will be name quality dot by user. Let's create a query, which in this case it will be select qual from quality qual where qual dot user dot id corresponds to user id, which will be the parameter that we'll be using. Okay, back to my data service. I will return create name query. In this case, quality by user. The return type will be quality objects. So the parameter will be, in this case, the name was user ID, and it will be user get ID, in this case, the value of the parameter that we're injecting, and we'll return a list. So with this, my data service is ready. I have the methods for creating new information and for reading it. And with this, we can proceed to create the user interface. We proceed to create our web pages, we need to do some adjustments. The first one is that we'll add a new dependency to our project, which will be Prime Faces. Prime Faces, it's a third-party library that contains custom JSF components that are ready and are very, very useful for the purposes of prettifying and organizing user interface. So we'll take advantage of that. In this case, I'll have to add the org.primefaces artifact, and I can use the current version, which is 8.0, which was released a few weeks ago from the time of this recording. Okay, once that is done, let's proceed to add my web pages. You can see here that I already have an index.html page that was added automatically by NetBeans by creating the project. I do not need this file, so I can safely delete it. Let's add first a folder called app, where my app pages will live, and then let's proceed to add two new JSF pages. The first one will be my home view, index.xhtml, and another page for my users view, aptly named users.xhtml. Okay. So before we proceed to modify these views, let's head and see the web.xml component. So the deployment descriptor already have some configuration for my corresponding web pages. You can see here that a new faces servlet has been added, which will map all the pages that corresponds to my faces prefix URL pattern. This is a convention, but I prefer just to use the suffix of the file, so we can change this to xhtml. And since we are going to be using my app prefix in order to hold the pages, my welcome page will be app index.html. Okay. Lastly, it doesn't hurt, but it will be a good idea to add the proprietary deployment descriptor for Payara named Payara Web XML that will allow me to save the context root of the application, which in this case will be secure. You can see here, and you can see that it was added here. Okay, good. So let's head to the users page, and let's start by setting all the information for all users. Remember, this page will only be accessible by admins and will allow me to see the profile of all users. So let's start by setting the title of the page to user information, and let's contain all the components inside a view. This is a standard JSF component. So the body of the page will be composed of a header, which will be using H3, and it will be saying all users, and inside we'll use a prime faces data table that will be containing the records for my users. So the data table needs to be bound to a list of objects. So how do we obtain this list of objects? Simple. Let's create a backend bin, which is a controller component that will hold the data and allow me to manipulate the information on the page. And this way I can talk directly to my JPA service. So in this case, let's add this new controller. Let's name it users controller. It will live inside the fish Payara demos controllers package. And my users controller will be a CDI bin of request scope, because we are only interested in instantiating this bin per HTTP request, and it'll have to be annotated with named in order to access it in expression language context, like what we're going to do next in the page. So in order to access the information for our users, I need to inject my trusty data service, and I need a variable to hold all users in this case. And this variable will be named aptly all users. So to populate that list, we'll use a public method called initialize, which will be annotated with the post construct annotation that will tell the JSF container that this bin will be, when this bin is initialized, this method will be called right away after the instance is created. So the only thing that I need to do is to simply set all users to the result of data service get all users. And lastly, I need a getter method so that I can access this property on the page. And that's it. Let's go back to my users table, my data table here on the web page, and the value will be set up to users controller, all users, and I'll need a variable to bind the current value of the user that I'm iterating here in this list, and I will aptly name it user. Next, I need to show the attributes of each user in multiple columns, so I'll use the prime faces column component, and each column will have a header text. Let's leave it empty for the moment, and it will require content. So the content will be JSF output text that will correspond to the value inside the object. So let's leave it empty for the moment. Okay, so we need 4 columns. Let's copy and paste them, and next let's populate them. So the first attribute will be the ID, and it will be bound to user.id. The second one will be the name, and it will be bound to username, user.name. The third one is, you guessed it, username, bound to user.username. And lastly, we'll see the group, and we'll bound it to user.group. So we have a view already that will allow me to see the information for all users. Now let's modify my home view. So the home view will be showing the profile of the user. So if in this case it will be it's his name or her name and their qualities. So let's do this. Add a new view. I need to specify the Alex prefix for the F namespace. The page title will be user profile in this case. And let's fill the body with a header as well. In this case, h3. Let's make it say this is your user profile. And let's use a prime faces panel to show the information for the user. So I need to access the list of qualities, and I will show them in a data list. But in order to do this, I also need to have access to a controller. So let's create a new control called home controller. And this controller, like the previous one, will be a request scope CDI bin. And I will need to inject my trusty data service. Very well then. So the first thing that I will need to do is have a variable to hold my user. Remember, my data service will return me an optional user type. So if in this case, I will call this current user, and I need a separate variable to hold the list of the user's qualities. So in this case, quality, and I need to import the list. Okay, and let's name this current qualities. Very well then. So in order to instantiate and prepare the controller, let's set up the post construct method, which in this case I'll name initialize as well. The first thing that I need to do is to retrieve the user, so I'll call data service get user, and I need a username. So for the moment, there is no way to know who is currently viewing the page because I have no secure authentication mechanisms. So let's set up a blank space, and we'll come back later to fill this. And after retrieving the user, if we have a user that was found in the database, we need to populate the qualities. So the way I prefer to do this is by calling current user, calling the if present method, which will require a consumer that will give me a user and allow me to execute a block of code. So in this case, if there is a user present, I will fill the qualities with the result of the data service get qualities from the user. And there it is. My method is ready. So let's prepare a getter method for the user. In this case, I will not be using an optional. So get current user. And what I will do is return this current user and call the else method. And if there is no user, then I will return a null value. Otherwise, I will return the object that is inside the optional. Why do I do this? Because I don't need to worry on my web page, because JSF, once the expression language encounters a null value, then it will stop resolution and it will just simply show an empty value on the page. I don't have to worry about null pointer exceptions breaking my page. And I need a getter method for my qualities list, so I can just simply add this. And that's it. My controller is ready. Let's go back to the index page. Let's proceed to add, then for the data list, I'll map a value, and in this case it will be home controller, current qualities, and I need a variable to bind the current quality that I'm inspecting inside. And finally, let's set the type of the list to order it so that the corresponding HTML element is used. Inside this, I will use quality and use the description attribute. Okay, so I'm showing the list of qualities for the corresponding user in the profile page or the home page. Now I'll add a facet. This facet, that will be the header of the data list, will contain the username. So in this case, the username can be accessed by calling home control current user and accessing the name property. And that's it. My profile page is ready. It would be nice to have a way to go from my profile page, will be the welcome page of my application, to the users view. So in this case, let's add a new command action that will allow me to navigate to that page. So inside the prime faces panel, we'll add a new facet, a footer facet, that will hold this command action. So in this case, the name will be footer. This facet will contain an H form because we need this in order to properly navigate to a separate JSF view, and we'll use a command button. The value of this command button will be all users because it will allow me to navigate to that view, and the action will be the navigation itself. So since we are navigating to the users view in the same folder, I can just simply say users, and JSF will automatically understand that I will navigate that it will navigate to the users.xhtml page. But I will proceed to add the faces redirect equals true query parameter to specify that the action of navigation will not be a forward, but instead will be a redirect. And there we go. My web pages are ready. So let's start by populating some sample information that we can use by in order to test our user interface. So in order to do this, the simplest way that I can use at the moment is to use a mock service, let's call it data initializer, that will be populating my database tables with some dummy data when the application is deployed the first time. So in order to do this, my data initializer, in this case, initializer will be an application scope CDI event, and it will only have one method called execute, which will be an observe method by using the observe CDI annotation on the initialize qualifier. Allow me to listen when every application scope CDI event is initialized. So when that is done, I will receive this event object, but I do not need that. And this method will be called when the application is deployed, and the CDI runtime scans and executes the initialize event on all application CDI scope pins. So what we want to do is to populate our database in the case, if in the case that we do not have any users. So I'll inject my trusty data service, and I'll fire a condition here that if there is no users, then we'll proceed to create two users. The first one will be Sally, and we'll use data service create user, so it will be Sally Adams. So the username will be S Adams. The password will be the same username, so remember this is development and we are not concerned at the moment with proper password policies. And the group will be an admin. So Sally will be an admin. That means that she can do everything in the platform. She can view her profile, and she can view information for the users. So my second user will be Tom. So data service create user Tom Matthews. His username will be The Matthews. and the same will be for his password. And he will be a simple user, so he can only view his own profile, but he can't see information for other users. So after creating this, let's create some qualities. So since Sally is an admin, we can say that in this case, data service create quality. Sally is wonderful in this case. She is a team player. She has good judgment. And she's a good leader as well. Okay, so we also want to say some nice things about Tom. So we can say that Tom is diligent, that Tom is responsible, and that Tom cares for his team. Teammates. So Sally will be created having 4 qualities, Tom will be created having 3 qualities, and we'll only run this once when our application is deployed. So having done this, let's clean and build my application again. Let's check out that we are running Payara Server 5201. Okay, let's disable deploy and save in order to prevent any on the deployments or redeployments, and that's it. Oh, before we run the application, we need to specify the user that we are going to be testing in my home controller. So remember here that in the username we'll leave it blank. Now we'll use Miss Sally as our test user, and we have to clean and build the application again. And let's proceed to run it. And you can see here that Miss Sally is appearing in the user profile for the application. So let's hit all users, and you can see here that Miss Sally can see information for her from her own profile and Mr. Tom. And with this, our application, its user interface is ready, and we can continue. So our final step will be, of course, security. So we have to do 3 things. One, we have to set up an identity store. That means where are the credentials and identities of the users that will be accessing in a secure manner our application, which is in this case our database tables. Second, we have to set up an authentication mechanism. That means how the users are going to identify themselves as valid users with access to the application. And in this case, we use a custom login page courtesy of Jakarta server spaces. And lastly, we have to set up authorization constraints. That means how can each user access each page and resource in the web application, and if they are allowed to execute some operations or not. And in this case, we'll use standardized Java authentication and authorization constraints via roles and groups. Okay, let's start then. So the first thing that I have to do is to create an application configuration class that will be used in order to configure our security components. So it will be located on the root package on the fish Payara demos. This class will be annotated with application scope because it will be a CDI bin. It will actually contain nothing, and we'll use it to annotate our security components into it. So the first component will be the identity store, and in this case, since my identities are in the database, I'll have to use the identity store definition annotation. The first attribute that I have to configure is the data source lookup, which will tell the annotation which is the data source that you are going to use in order to locate your identities. And in this case, it will be the same data source that we are using for persistence configuration. So JDBC Secure APIs. The next attribute will be the caller query. The caller query will tell the identity store how will you identify this user. So in this case, we're using the password, and we are extracting the password from the users table depending on the specific username that we are receiving in our authentication request. So remember that this is talking directly to the database, so we are not speaking in JPQL, this is just plain SQL. Lastly, I need the groups query, and the groups query will allow me to retrieve all the user groups that corresponds to this user. So in this case, it will be select user group where users, sorry, in this case it's not where, it's from, where the username equals to the parameter that I'm receiving. So if you are familiar with prepared statements, prepared SQL statements, this uses the same notation. Okay, so before going on with the next step, we have to know something. The database identity store definition retrieves the passwords in a hash state, because that is normally the recommended way to store information in the database when you're talking about credentials and passwords. So the standard and default definition uses a PPD2K password definition, and the Java or Jakarta EE Security API gives you the ability to hash and verify that information using the same algorithm. You can configure it to your liking, but the defaults are usually good enough. So we need to change the way that we are storing our passwords, because when the security components will match the passwords, they are at the moment storing plain text, and that won't work. So we have to go to the create user method, and here we'll inject the PVK to the DF to password interface, which will allow me, let's name it password hasher, which will allow me to hash the password and store that information there. So password hasher here will generate a new hash based on the password, but since this man uses a character array, we'll have to convert it. And that's it. Back to our application config information. So next is the custom authentication mechanism. So remember, we are going to use a login form. So in this case, I have to use the custom form authentication mechanism, which requires a definition to the login to continue page. This is a login to continue configuration that will tell the server what to do when the server is when the user is unauthenticated. So I have to specify a login page. In this case, it will be login.xhtml. I'll have to specify a error page, but in this case I'll leave it blank because we want to remain on the same page to notify the user that the authentication attempt has been unsuccessful. And lastly, I will have to use the use forward to login attribute and set it to false, because I want not to use the forward mechanic. I want to redirect users to this login page so that it is visible on the browser. So let's create this login page. So on the web pages, let's create a new page called login HTML. Okay, so let's start by creating the view element. Let's set a title, so in this case login page. Now let's set up the body of the login component. So in this case we'll use prime faces output panel, and let's do some CSS magic here by using a div container that will be using the UEG class, which is a default bootstrap theme class that is already available on prem phases. We don't have to do anything else. In this case, let's use another div as a separator. So in this case, we use UEG4 in order to give some spacing. And inside this, let's put an H3 element that will say login with your credentials. And let's add an style to center this. So it would be text align center and then a form, because we are going to require 2 inputs. So inside this form, but first let's define the login ID for the form to identify it globally. We'll define a messages component. This will be useful when we have to notify the user that the authentication attempt has been unsuccessful. So let's set this to messages, its ID, and specify that it will only apply to global messages, which are messages that do not belong to a specific component. Next, let's use a panel grid because we want to line the elements. So in this case, it will be having 3 columns. Let's add a cells padding of 3, and let's define style with no margin to center. Okay, so I need to use then an output label that will correspond to the username, another one from the password, and let's add some input text. So prime faces input text. In this case, the first one will be for the username. So ID will be username. Value will be corresponding to a backing bin, which I need now. So let's add a new control called login controller. So you know the drill by now. We need this to be a CDI event. So request scope, and it will be name. And I need to define a username and a password. And I also want to validate that these are not empty, just in the case that I do not want to excite the server with a future authentication attempts. So I'll use the bin validation not empty annotations to force the interface to notify the users when these values are empty. So I have to add getters and setters for these 2 elements because we are writing to the bin from the web page. So here, value will be login controller, username, okay. And I need a message component in the case that the validation that I set in the controller fails. So in this case, it will be for username, and here the output label we have to specify that this is for the username, so it is properly lined up. Okay, so let's copy and paste because we are lazy. Change here password, in this case the ID is password, and the message here is password, and the element in the login controller will be password. And since this is obviously a password we're talking about, we need to specify that to the input so that the typing is hidden. Okay, so that completes our input components. We now need an action to properly execute the authentication. So first I'll have to specify that the ID of this button is to submit. Since this is a prime faces component, I have to specify which section of the form is of the page is updated. So in this case, I'll update the form in which the button is contained. The value will be, of course, login, because that is what I need to do. The action then will require an action on my login controller to execute the authentication. So for the moment, let's set it up to void execute. Let's leave it empty for the moment. So in this case, it will be login controller execute. Let's delete the parentheses. And lastly, this is important, I have to set the AJAX flag to false in order to do a full request, full HTTP request to the server, because partial requests won't allow my authentication to be completed in the way that I'm intending. So this will translate into a minor page refresh for the user in the case that the authentication is failed, but it doesn't matter, it's just a minor inconvenience to them. So with this, the page is fully ready. Let's go to my controller and let's finish this. So for my login controller to be successful, I have to execute my authentication here. I need the following components. First, I have to inject the faces context class, which will allow me to have access to the request, current request and response managed by the underlying servlet container. I also need to inject the security context in order to, of course, execute the authentication process. So in this case, and keep this in mind, you will be using the Java Security Enterprise interface. So security context. For the faces context to be annotated, we first have to go to the application class and annotate this with faces config, because otherwise you will be forced to provide your own faces configuration file. But since Jakarta server faces 2.3, then you are allowed to just simply annotate the application configuration class with this, and then you are allowed to do this injection without issues. So let's save, So let's populate our execute method. First, I need two helper methods. One to obtain a third context called the external context, which is the one that will allow me access to the underlying servlet constructs. So in this case, how do I obtain this? Simple, I call face context, get external context, and then I need a method to execute my authentication attempt. So in this case, the outcome of that will be authentication status. Let's call this process authentication, and then I will return security context dot authenticate. So I need the request, the response, and the parameters. So in order to retrieve the first two, I need the external context. Let's call it AC. Get external context. The request will be AC dot get request, but as you can see here, this is an object, so I need to cast it to HTTP servlet request. Let's copy and paste this. So here will be get response. And the parameters will be used for inputting the credentials. So in this case, I need to use the authentication parameters. And I have to call the with params method that will give me a builder that I can use to call the to set up the authentication. So in this case, I will use credential. And in this case, I'll use the new username password credential that will receive a caller name, in this case, a username and the password. Okay, and I have to use here HTTP servlet response, and that's it. So, depending on the outcome of the authentication, I need to act on my execute method. So, let's execute it. And the possible outcomes are, in this case, The first one will be send continue. That means that the authentication needs to continue, and you have to complete first, in this case, your current response. In this case, it will be response complete. The second outcome can be, in this case, send failure, which means that the process couldn't be completed, probably because of invalid credentials. So in this case, I need to notify the user. So let's use the add message method for the face context. In this case, it is a global message, so there's no client ID. I have to set up a new face message. In this case, I have to specify a severity and a summary. The severity will be faces message, severity error, because it is a user error. And the message would be invalid credentials. And there is no detail, so in this case, no. So let's break here. And lastly, success means that the authentication is complete. So in this case, I have to redirect the user to the home page. So I'll use get into external context, redirect, access the current request path, which in this case is get request context path. And I'll say you will go to app index HTML and break. And this method will throw an exception. So for the purposes of this exercise, I'll just simply throw it. And because the correct way to do this will be to absolve this exception and notify the user of an internal error and let the administrator of the application to deal with it. Okay, so my login controller is done. My custom form authentication is fully ready. My database and identity store information is ready as well. Lastly, the only thing that I need to do is to specify my security constraints. So I'll go to the WebXML page and I'll add two security constraints. So the first one will be for the admin role, which in this case is a user that can build its own profile and the user's view. So in this case, I have to specify the display name will be admin role. It will depend on this web resource collection, which is the pages or servlet resources that I can allow to access. So in this case, it will be everything under the folder. And I have to specify here a description, a web resource name, which in this case will be all app pages. And I have to specify the authorization constraint, which in this case will be for the admin role. Okay. So with this done, now we have to define a second security constraint that corresponds to the user role. But the user role, unfortunately, can only see the profile page. So in this case, it will be the app index HTML profile page. And in this case, it will be the admin role. However, we have to also give access to the user role, to the admin role, because otherwise this pattern definition will override this more general one. So admins won't be able to access their own profile pages. Okay, very well done. So those are our two security constraints and our application is ready. So let's clean and build. And while the application is building, we'll need to clear out our database, because at the moment, remember that we created data using the unhashed passwords. So here I have these 3 statements to delete all qualities users and commit. And that's it. And our application is ready to go. So let's run it. Okay, so you can see here that I'm welcome with the login page. So let's try to log in with with Sally Adams, but let's try an invalid credential. So you can see here that yes, I'm receiving invalid credentials. So let's try again with her password, which is a username for the purposes of this exercise. Let's log in, and you can see here that I was logged in. And you can see here that I'm showing Sally Adams as the user profile, and I can go to all users and I can also see the information. However, it will be good, remember that we are fixing the value here, that it will obtain the value dynamically for the current user that is authenticated. Also, there's no way to log out, that means invalidate the current authentication and retry with another user. So let's test that. So let's go to the home controller, and here let's modify the current username and let's obtain it using our security context. So let's inject the JPA Enterprise security context, in this case this one, and here under Sally Adams let's replace it with get call principal, which will allow me to access the principal interface, and the username is contained within the name of the principal. Okay, so this way, depending on the user that is logged in, we'll be accessing the absolutely correct profile there. Also, we need an action in order to finish the current authentication security context. So let's add a logout action. So in this case, it will be logout. And what we want to do in this case is to access the external context. So in this case, I also have to inject the faces context. So in this case, I'll have to do this. External context, EC will be faces context, get external context, and then I have to do external context EC dot get request, encapsulate this on a cast to HTTP servlet request, and call the logout method. So this way it is invalid. And then, since we are navigating away to the login page, I will navigate to login, HTML, and then I want this to be a redirect, so faces redirect equal true. Okay, and the logout action can return a servlet exception, so let's, for the purposes of the exercise, set it here on a throw. Let's go back to my home page and add a new button here. So in this case, it will be a new command button. The value will be logout, and the action will be, in this case, the home controller logout, and that's it. So let's clean and build. Let's rerun my application. Let's try again. Miss Sally Adams. Let's log in. You can see, of course, a user profile. Now I correctly retrieve from the current security context. We can go and see all users. Let's log out, and let's now log in with Mr. Tom Matthews credentials. And you can see here that now you are seeing Tom Matthews' profile and his qualities. Let's try to access the all users, and you can see here that you're getting a 403 because Mr. Tom has only the user role, the user, and he belongs to the user group. He's not authorized to access this one. So that's it. So wrapping up, with this tutorial you have learned that custom security via the custom authentication login form is easy to set up. You only need a login Java Jakarta server faces page, and you have to configure your login controller or your backing bean in this case with the correct steps to process the authentication status as results. That identity stores are easy to set up as well. In this case we use a database store definition, and with a couple of queries pointing out what the data for the user credentials and the groups are, you are good to go. The Java Persistence API is also easily integrated with the JSF. So in this case, you could see that we just created a service that will allow us to manipulate the data and take that data as simple POJOs in Java objects and pass it over to the backing beans and the controllers on our pages and show them quickly. And lastly, the authorization roles defining the deployment description are simple to manage. You only need to know which pages are you going to constrain, and you need to know which roles or groups will have access to which resources, and that's it. So hopefully you will be now be prepared to create more secure applications using these components and APIs on your environment. So thank you so much. If you're still not using Payara, download Payara Server or Payara Micro from our official web page, and there are more resources on getting started with application development and management. See you soon. Bye.